Okay, wonderful. So I'll get screen sharing going here. All right, thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm joining you from Alberta, from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. Right now I'm joining you from my home, which is on Papa Stu lands, lands that were stolen from those people. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about climate change. I always say that any day that I get to talk about climate change is always a really good day. So today's a good day and a good start into the weekend, I think. So today I'm going to be talking about climate change and health, and that topic specifically as it relates to the IPCC report that was just published last year, as well as COP27. So, climate change is increasingly covered in the news. I feel like we see it all the time. Last night, I did a quick search in Google News just for climate change, and there were tons of hits of things that had been released just in those past, 12 hours. Everything from, looking for climate change solutions, like looking at electric cars, not being the magic pill to save us from climate change. Assessments in the United States looking at which cities are doing the best or which cities might be hit hardest by climate change. There's lots of discussion in Canada, especially in Alberta, but around the world about the role of hydrogen as a climate change solution, or if it is a climate change solution. And of course, climate change enters into politics all the time. But, I think it's also really important to recognize that climate change is a health issue. So oftentimes we think about climate change as an environmental issue. That's how the general public tends to view it. But there's been a lot of really good research coming from the United States, and actually just recently in the past couple of weeks, a global study that looked at how we can frame climate change to best inspire action. So if we frame climate change as an economic issue, will that inspire change? Or if we frame it as a national security issue, will that inspire people to, want to take part in climate change action? What framing motivates climate change action? And consistently across the board, across all of these studies, it's a health framing. So if you frame climate change as a health issue, that is the best way to inspire climate change action. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. And I think that, if you talk about climate change, at least in climate change circles, you can't really talk about climate change science without talking about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC considers their reports to be the gold standard on climate change science. And the IPCC is under the World Meteorological Organization, as well as the United Nations Environmental Program. And it brings together science experts from around the world to assess the state of climate change science. And so the most recent report, I was one of the lead authors on it for Working Group 2, which is the report that looks at climate change impacts and climate change adaptation. So how we adapt to those changes. And I think that this quote from the report really summarizes the key takeaway from the report. And that's basically that the science is incredibly clear. Climate change is a threat to human well-being as well as the health of our entire planet. And we can't delay any further action if we want to secure a livable future. So let's break that down a little bit and look at that in a little more detail. All right. I think that this is something that Canadians are increasingly familiar with. Just think about the last couple of years. We've had a number of different extreme events across the country. We've experienced heat domes, wildfires, increases in floods, droughts. The East Coast had an awful storm that was fueled by climate change. These types of experiences are not unfamiliar to us anymore. And it makes talking about climate change in the general public a little bit easier. But it's not just those extreme events, it's also the slow onset changes. So gradual increases in temperature, ocean acidification, sea level rise, all of these things have been documented definitely in the past decade. And we also are looking at projections that show that those are going to continue to get worse until mid-century and definitely by the end of the century. And of course, these things impact literally billions of people around the world. And one of the new findings of the IPCC report is that it impacts people around the world despite our efforts to adapt. So we have adaptation strategies in place. We're trying to implement adaptation so we can become more resilient to these impacts. But climate change continues to impact billions of people around the world, even with those different adaptation strategies. And of course, we know that these impacts are not evenly distributed around the world. They're very inequitably distributed. And one really key and important finding in the IPCC report was that things like colonialism are at the root cause of that vulnerability. So for the first time in IPCC history, we talked about the role of colonialism as it relates to creating vulnerability and being at the root cause of vulnerability, and also how it hampers our ability to adapt to climate change. We also know that climate change has impacted the health of millions of people around the world. So this was another one of the IPCC conclusions, was that millions of people's health has already been impacted. And sometimes when we talk about climate change and health, people think that it might be, it's something that either is going to happen far away temporally or far away geographically. So maybe, sure, climate change is impacting people's health, but, this is only in faraway places, like maybe like African countries, for example. Or that climate change will impact the health of Canadians, but this is something that's far away temporally. So, this is something that's going to happen, mid-century or by the end of the century. But the IPCC report makes it really clear that it's already impacting our health. It's already impacting the health of our communities. And we also know that from a national perspective within Canada, Health Canada's most recent climate change and health assessment, which was just published last year, makes it very clear that climate change is already impacting the health of Canadians. So how is it impacting our health? As I go through the next few slides, I want you to think about these in your own context too. Think about yourself, think about your family, think about your community, and reflect on whether you've seen some of these changes. Have these changes entered your household? Have you experienced some of these changes? Or maybe your community has. So the report covers, the common climate change and health outcomes: waterborne disease, foodborne disease, heat-related morbidity and mortality, air pollution, and health related to air pollution and climate change. And these are the different health outcomes that past IPCC reports have actually covered and covered quite well. So the report, extends and expands on those and goes into a lot more depth and does an update of what we know in the literature. But there's a couple of new findings that I just wanted to highlight today. And the first was on vector-borne diseases. So the report in the past reports have definitely covered vector-borne diseases, but it's one of the first times that it goes into a lot more detail for North America, specifically for vector-borne diseases. And the main conclusions were that, changing environmental conditions are meaning that we're seeing early seasonal activity of different vectors. We're seeing range expansion of vectors up into Canada, especially in Western Canada and in Ontario as well. And we're seeing that this is leading to increased risk of transmission. One of the other new findings was around malnutrition. So again, the reports in the past have covered malnutrition. We know that climate change impacts nutrition, but it was the first time that we started to look at this in detail in North America specifically too. And past reports tended to focus on how climate change is impacting crop yields. So, how it's impacting staple crops, how it's impacting, corn, maize, rice, and how that impacts our caloric availability. So, are there enough calories to feed the world, and how is climate change impacting that? But this time the report went into more of the nutritional side of it. So we also looked at the diversity of foods that would be available in a changing climate and looked at how that would change nutrition. And we actually found that the diversity of food is actually much more important for health than the caloric intake. And so climate change impacts on caloric intake will obviously be a concern, but what's actually a bigger concern and will have a bigger impact on the health of people around the world will be the changes that climate change has on the diversity of foods that are available for us. And we've already started to see that in the past decade, and we'll continue to see that in the future with the changing climate. The next outcome that I wanted to cover was mental health. This is the first time in IPCC history that we did an in-depth and detailed assessment on how climate change is already impacting mental health. And that's because just in the past decade, there's been a lot of research that's been published on this topic. It's really an exploding area of climate change and health research, an exploding area of research in general. And so for the first time, we had enough information to actually assess this in detail. And we came to the conclusion that climate change has already had both severe and widespread impacts on mental health. So what does that look like? Well, you'll see in the report that we actually cover climate change impacts on mental health in almost every single chapter. So it's something that layers on top of everything else. So the way that climate change impacts the ocean, the way that climate change impacts our food systems, the way that climate change impacts our cities, all of those things have a mental health layer on top of it. It doesn't matter what region you're looking at, Africa, Asia, Australasia, Europe, North America, small islands, it's impacting mental health everywhere. And it's impacting mental health through three main pathways. And the first is extreme weather events. And this is something that I think that people can relate to. I mean, obviously, if you have to evacuate your home and your community, that's a very traumatic experience. And so maybe it's not that surprising that that is associated, from a science perspective, with things like post-traumatic stress, with depression, with anxiety. Those experiences obviously take a toll on our mental health when we're experiencing them. For example, there's some really strong research that comes from the UK that looked at how flooding events in the UK have been associated with PTSD, with depression and anxiety, both during the event, but also after the event. So things like our ability to administer insurance, to rebuild, all of those processes that families and households have to deal with after the event itself is also associated with depression, is also associated with PTSD and anxiety as well. So it's not just the impacts of the event itself, but it's also dealing with the aftermath of the event. The other pathway that climate change impacts mental health through is through these slower onset changes. So these are things like permafrost loss, sea ice coverage is decreasing, sea level rise, all of these slower onset processes also impact health, especially of Indigenous populations. So we found in our assessment that a lot of different cultural heritage sites around the world are disappearing because of sea level rise and coastal erosion. And this obviously has really important spiritual health and mental health impacts on Indigenous peoples. And then the last pathway that we assessed was actually, that you can have mental health outcomes from climate change, even if you haven't experienced climate change impacts yourself. So for example, if you are looking through Twitter or you're watching the news, we're constantly bombarded with images of climate change, of flooding, of devastation, of destruction from climate change. And the science is showing us increasingly that can impact our mental health too. So watching other people experiencing the impacts of climate change takes a toll on our mental health. We also know that the way we teach about climate change in school can also have an impact on the mental health of students. So it's also really important to us reflect, especially if you're an educator, on how you're talking about climate change in the classroom, because these can have important mental health consequences as well. So this is the part where I'd like to just take a moment and pause, and we're going to pop up a poll, a question for you to answer. And we would like you to reflect on those different health impacts of climate change. And I was wondering if you have experienced any of these impacts yourself, maybe your family, your community. Have you experienced mental health impacts? What about heat-related impacts, foodborne, waterborne disease? Maybe exacerbating respiratory conditions like asthma or other impacts in general. So we're still getting some answers pop in. So we're seeing lots of people reporting mental health impacts as well as heat-related impacts, for sure. And I mean, I think that this generally reflects when I talk to people, this is generally, it reflects what they're experiencing. There's a lot of worry around climate change. There's a lot of concern. There's a lot of feeling helpless around climate change or climate change anxiety. So, it looks like just in our own group that a lot of people have either experienced mental health impacts of climate change themselves or seen others who are close to them experience some of those impacts. Okay, so I'll pop to the next slide. So we also know in the report that even small increases in global warming will result in increased risks. Sometimes people think about the Paris Agreement, which aims to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees as that's not very much. Like if we only warmed by 1.5 degrees, does that really matter? Well, we've already, seen a temperature increase of 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. And if we hit that 1.5 degrees Celsius, we know that from a health perspective, we're definitely going to see increased impacts on climate change. And we're already starting to see that. And if we hit 2 degrees, in some places, we just don't have the adaptation strategies in place to actually adapt to that and to protect public health. So if we hit 2 degrees Celsius, there will be a lot of spots in our health sector and our health system where we will hit this limit to adaptation, and we could see our health system be overwhelmed. But in the report, we not only talk about all these, really devastating impacts of climate change that we've already experienced and that we're projecting to continue to experience into the future, we also look at options to reduce the risks. So we also focus on solutions in the report. And so if we look at some examples of some of these health solutions that are covered in the report, there are things within the health sector. So things like heat plans are really important. Early warning systems, we know that they're effective if we're able to tell people in advance that a storm is coming or that some sort of system is coming through. People can be prepared. We can implement evacuation if needed. We also know that mental health services are really important in emergency responses. And in the report, we use a good case study coming from Australia and the wildfires that they had in 2020. And we look at the important role that mental health services played in those wildfires. So for example, the federal government had increased the hours that mental health services were available. They also implemented and made more widespread telehealth services for mental health. They also implemented specific mental health programs targeted at youth. And we know that those had positive impacts. But an important finding from the report is that actually a lot of the health benefits from adaptation actually happen outside of the health sector. So these are things that other sectors are doing can either positively or negatively impact our health. So things like improving food security, making sure we have safe drinking water supplies, increasing green space and blue space. These are all things that happen outside of the health sector, but actually have really important co-benefits for health. We also, in a report, we assessed adaptation around the world. So we looked at adaptation efforts that were in place and we did an assessment on them. And we basically found that adaptation has definitely increased in the last decade, but progress is really uneven. And quite frankly, we're not adapting fast enough. We also found that most adaptation strategies are in their planning stage and haven't actually moved into action phases yet, or the implementation phase. And, that's a problem. And so it'll be really interesting to see in a Canadian context what's going to happen with this national adaptation strategy. So Canada's very first national adaptation strategy was just released in November, but it's still technically in the planning stages. We haven't started to see anything move into that implementation phase yet. So even within Canada, we tend to be stuck in this planning phase, and we need to figure out a way to actually move into implementation and figure out how to move some of these things forward. And we've definitely seen a lot of leadership from the health sector on how we can actually do that. At the same time, we also know that risks are becoming increasingly complex, so they're a lot harder to manage. So a health example could be, climate change creating drought conditions, which has immediate health consequences. It also has consequences on the economy as well. But that can lead to increased wildfires in the area. And then if you have a wildfire happening after that flooding event, then you have, additional health concerns to be concerned about in addition to that flooding event. So you're worried about things like respiratory illnesses as well as mental health impacts. So we're seeing both compounding and cascading events are already starting to take place and hitting the health sector, and we're expecting those to continue to happen into the future, which will really also challenge our ability to manage these impacts. The report really concludes by saying that we know what we need to do, we just need to start doing it. So we know what we need to do to reduce greenhouse gases. We know what we need to do to adapt to some of these climate changes that we're already experiencing. We just have to move some of these things into action. And really, every single decision that we make today will take us either closer to or further away from a climate resilient future. So then that's the main IPCC conclusions from this report on impacts and adaptation. But sometimes people ask me, okay, how does the IPCC come to these conclusions? So I want to take a second to do a second poll for you. And so we'll just pull this up. And I'm wondering what your experience has been with the IPCC. Maybe you've never even heard of the IPCC until this presentation, or maybe you've read their reports, maybe you've been an author yourself. Maybe you were one of the peer reviewers, or you were involved in the secretariat or something like that. So if you can just take a moment to answer this question. So lots of people have heard of the IPCC. Some people have read some of the reports. Some people have used it in their jobs. I know I certainly use it a lot in teaching. I cite it in my own publications. I use their figures a lot too, and I see their figures and used in others people's presentation a lot as well. There's some people who have reviewed the reports, which is really important. They really those reviewers shape the reports for sure. Okay, so let's go into the IPCC process a little bit then. So how do these reports even come to be? Well, it starts with the author selection process. So each government, each member state will do a call for authors. So different people, if you have climate change expertise, you can apply to be an author on the IPCC reports. Then different member states make their selections and they nominate those people to the IPCC. Then the IPCC goes through those nominations and they select people based on expertise, based on gender and regional representation as well. So then those authors are selected. We come together for in-person meetings. So there's usually 4 lead author meetings for each report that are in person. This takes place over 3 or 4 years. And in between each of those meetings, there are several meetings each week at all hours of the day to work on these reports together. It's an iterative draft process. So there are actually 3 drafts that are created, and each of those drafts go through a round of revisions. The first draft is open for peer review from anyone. So any expert from around the world can peer review these reports, as well as governments. And the second iteration goes under the same. And then the final draft is reviewed by governments. So then after that draft is created, we create a summary for policymakers. So a smaller group of authors is selected to create the summary for policymakers, which is a shorter version of the key findings of the report that's supposed to be really policy facing and intended for heads of state. And this summary for policymakers is reviewed line by line in a UN IPCC formal plenary session. So in this picture here, you can see that there's text on the screen. There's a sentence highlighted in green. That means that sentence has been approved. There's a sentence highlighted in yellow, which means it's under discussion. And then the other sentences haven't been read yet. And during this time, the authors sit at the front here, as you can see, and we basically get grilled by the government. So we have to answer all sorts of questions about the science supporting these sentences. Sometimes we clarify the text, make changes to wording to make it clearer. Sometimes we change the text to be more policy relevant, so that it's more useful for governments. And we go through this process line by line. But what's really interesting about this process is that member states have pretty big delegations that they send. Sometimes a member state will send like a delegation of like 30 people. And what's really interesting is that some member states, especially oil producing member states, will have teams of lawyers that are there to look at the wording, because these reports actually matter. They have implications. That the stakes at some of these sessions can be high. Because basically when they sign up on this report, they're saying that they support the science and they agree with the science that we've presented in these reports, and they agree to take action based on them. All right, and so that, yeah, these are just a couple more pictures of what it looks like in the room. So what I wanted to do now was go through an example of this special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. So the cryosphere is basically all the frozen bits of the world. And so on this report, we assessed almost 7,000 studies. There are 104 authors from 36 different countries. 31% of the authors were women, and we received 31,000 peer review comments. And as authors, we have to respond to every single peer review comment. And it's a very transparent process. All the reviewer comments are actually posted and published with the report. And all of our responses to every single comment are also published as well. It's honestly the most rigorous peer review process that I've ever been a part of. It's pretty intense. And for this report, one of the main conclusions was that the impact that climate change has on the ocean and cryosphere has implications for nature and for humanity. They impact us all. And what I wanted to do is just highlight two specific examples. One is food security and the other is nutrition. So here's a statement from the summary for policymakers. That means that this sentence has been approved by all of the member states, the 195 member states that are part of the IPCC. So it says that food and water security have been negatively impacted by changes in snow cover, lake and river ice, and permafrost in many Arctic regions, and we assess this with high confidence. These changes have disrupted access to and food availability within herding, hunting, fishing, and gathering areas, harming the livelihoods and cultural identity of Arctic residents, including Indigenous populations. And we assess that with high confidence. So how did we get to this statement? Well, it's based on a ton of different research. So it's also not just based on Western science, it's also based on Indigenous knowledge. So for example, in the report, we use this study from Nunatsiavut in northern Labrador, where people reported that the ice is no longer predictable and it's not safe to travel on, and that people are jeopardizing their lives trying to go out to secure food. We also used a study from Alaska that found that people who reported changes in travel plans had increased odds of hypothermia and frostbite, and people who reported unusual weather when they were out securing food had increased odds of unintentional injury and death. And it's not just foods like caribou, like you can see in this video, but it's also plants as well. So this is a quote from an elder in one study who said last year they had no blueberries, and she talks about what that means for them and how that's unheard of. And it's not just country foods, like going out to procure locally harvested foods. It's also foods in the grocery stores in the north. So there were also people in these studies talking about how the food sources that they usually get to, you can't reach them out on the land because there's just not enough ice. And it's alarming that they're just beginning to see the impacts of climate change. And if the weather's bad for weeks, how do you get food into the communities? How do you fly food in? And they shared stories about how stocks in the stores were down to bare bones because there was just no way to get food into the communities. The next example is nutrition. So here's the statement that was in the summary for policymakers. Increases in the risks for seafood security associated with decreases in seafood availability are projected to elevate the risk to nutritional health in some communities who are highly dependent on seafood, such as those in the Arctic, West Africa, and small island developing states. So again, this was a statement from the summary for policymakers that was approved by all the member states. And I wanted to share one study from British Columbia. Actually, this was a series of studies from British Columbia that helped us build that statement. So seafood is obviously full of all sorts of good nutrition, vitamins and minerals, and communities, BC First Nation communities, many depend on the seafood as a really important part of their diet. And these studies show that under climate change projections that seafood availability would decrease because of warming oceans. And this under a low emission scenario, so if we hit the Paris Agreement targets, if we reduce our emissions, that this would still result in a 21% decrease in nutritional intake by mid-century. And if we continued, sort of business as usual and continuing to increase our emissions year over year, that we would see a 32% decrease in nutrient intake by 2050. And so people often say like, okay, so what? Just go to the grocery store and get food that way. Well, what the studies also did is they looked at substituting seafood with non-traditional foods like chicken or canned tuna, and they looked at other foods as well. And they found that still the nutrients lost from the decreased seafood availability was not replaced by substitutions in the store. And this just really highlights the real importance of traditional food sources for Indigenous populations, Indigenous peoples, in terms of their nutrition and health, and especially in the context of climate change. So those are just two examples, but across this report, if this is the typical IPCC warming graph, we've seen temperatures continue to increase until today. And looking forward into the future, we have different scenarios. We have different trajectories that we can pick. If we pick a lower emissions trajectory and we limit our warming and meet the Paris Agreement, we know that we'll still see health impacts continue to increase into the future, but we know that with increased adaptation efforts, this will help. This will protect health. But if we continue on with business as usual and continue to increase our emissions, we know that not only health impacts will increase, but increased adaptation will not be enough to protect health. And so then the final question that I'd like to pose in this session is, how does that feed into decision-making arenas? And so this is my third and final question for you. And it's a true or false question. If you could just have that popped up. There we go. So the IPCC reports support international policy. Is that true or false? All right, we have lots of trues, also some false. Okay, I'll let it go for just a couple more seconds. All right, it's starting to slow down. And so this was really a trick question because the answer is both yes and no. I think it depends on how you view the question. Certainly the intention is for these IPCC reports is to support decision-making. Whether it actually supports decision-making or not, I'm not sure. And so, I just wanted to bring up this picture again, just to remind you that the summary for policymakers, that countries do send really large delegations because they do sometimes feel that the stakes are high in these reports. And the reason that they feel that way is because of the climate change COPs, the Conference of the Parties. So every year, countries get together and they negotiate climate change at these annual COPs. So this is where we saw things like the Kyoto Protocol come together. This is where we saw the Paris Agreement be struck. This is a video from Glasgow last year, or I guess the year before last, COP26. That's where the Glasgow Pact was formed. And then this just past year in Egypt. And what's really interesting about, there we go, about these sessions is that decision makers come together to negotiate climate change, but the IPCC reports actually underpin the negotiations. So the IPCC reports are supposed to form the scientific basis on which the negotiations take place. So these are a couple of videos from COP27, and I was there part of the IPCC delegation, and we were there as a resource for countries if they had questions about the climate change science. If they, wanted our support, we were there to provide it. We also gave, lots of presentations in these side booths for, other people who are interested in the topic. But if you go through their the minutes of the meetings, you'll see that countries actually acknowledge the IPCC reports throughout the negotiations, and they'll bring up certain sentences from the SPM or from the report itself saying, look, like we agreed that this is happening and we need to take action on this. And so theoretically, it's supposed to inform decision making. Whether it actually does, I guess is a question, and it depends how cynical you are. But the thing that I love about the COPs the most is that civil society really shows up. And this is a picture from COP26, and I wanted to highlight it in particular because COP26 in Glasgow was the first time that there was a health pavilion at COP. So it meant that it was the first time that climate change impacts on health was really front and center and on people's minds. And you can see here in these pictures that there were a lot of civil society protests that actually had a health flavor to them. And the civil society that shows up really matters. So at Glasgow, for instance, when you went from the train station to the venue, didn't matter if you were a negotiator, if you were part of a country delegation, if you were somebody like me who was there, or another scientist or someone else, you had to like literally walk through crowds of people protesting for climate change action, which I think is really inspiring. It definitely like sets a tone for that day as you enter the venue. And so COP27, some people would classify COP27 as a failure because it, didn't deal with fossil fuels clearly enough. But there were a lot of successes at COP27 too. And I wanted to highlight one of them that is considered a success for many low-income countries as well as regions who are highly impacted by climate change. And that's the decisions around loss and damage funds. And loss and damage is this really critically important concept that countries who are high polluters should have to pay for the losses and damages that low polluting countries experience due to climate change. So for example, if you're a small island state and you have impacts to your infrastructure, you should be able to apply to some sort of fund that's funded by the high polluting states to be able to make some repairs. So that this was a really important thing, I think, that came out of COP27. And in the IPCC report, we did a lot of assessment around loss and damage, what losses have already been experienced, what damages have already been experienced, and what needs to be done to overcome those, including from a health perspective. So with that, I think I'll end there, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions or to have a discussion.